I have some slides. My name's Scott Ewing, and I served in the Army from September 2004 through September 2007 as a cavalry scout. I deployed to Iraq about a month after finishing basic training as a private first class with the 3rd Armored Cavalry Regiment. We spent most of our time in Tal Afar. It's a city of about 200,000 people just west of Mosul in the north. After we completed our year-long tour of duty in March 2006, our deployment was described by President Bush as a model of counterinsurgency operations. He said of Tal Afar that it was a free city that gives reason for hope for a free Iraq. The media pounced on this, and almost immediately there was criticism of this optimistic assertion. Newsweek questioned whether things had really improved that much. For one thing, we had driven out thousands of Sunni and created a more homogeneous population of predominantly Shia tribes. Additionally, by the end of our deployment, we had about 1,000 troops per square kilometer in the city. Between then and now, Tal Afar has seen some of the most violent and deadly attacks of this occupation. When we first arrived at Camp Sykes, there were frequent attacks on U.S. forces. I was in a scout platoon. I was a dismount in a Bradley. And initially we began by doing fairly simple operations. We did overwatch missions to try to detect people placing IEDs on main supply routes, and patrols in neighborhoods that were viewed as relatively safe. One of the first things we noticed when we went into the city is that kids approached our vehicles fairly fearlessly, and my job was to get out of the Bradley and stand next to it and provide security. And we had an interpreter with us. All the kids they didn't necessarily approach us at first, but they all did this. So I asked the interpreter what this means, and he said it means they want soccer balls, because apparently the unit before us had frequently taken soccer balls out and given them to the kids. Sometimes they also made a motion like this, which meant they wanted an MRE. So the previous unit had routinely handed things out to the local kids as they patrolled the neighborhoods. It was billed as a gesture of goodwill. And we began to bring candy out in bags, and the guys up in the turret of the Bradleys would throw it out to the sides of the vehicle. As soon as they did this, of course, the kids all rushed to the side of the vehicle and hung out and fought for the candy. Our interpreter suggested there was another motive, which was also repeated or implied by other people in my unit, which was that if the kids are around our vehicles, the bad guys won't attack. Whether it was a gesture of goodwill or whether we were using kids as human shields, there were other times when our vehicles stood in safe areas of the city where we had formed an alliance with a local Shia tribe. Soon, the children in this area became more of an annoyance than anything, and we stopped bringing candy out on missions. Not long after we got to Tal Afar, we were told that 2 rival tribes had fought over control of the hospital in the city. The tribe that currently controlled the hospital, we were told, wanted us to come and provide security for it. So we started doing rotations at the hospital. There were already Iraqi army troops stationed there on the roof, inside the hospital, and at the gates. At first, we took over a room on the ground floor with hospital beds in it, with our weapons, and that's where we stayed. Of course, as soon as we arrived, the hospital was attacked, and all the Iraqi army troops on the roof fired wildly out into the neighborhoods. So within a few hours of us arriving, soon the hospital saw patients. There were virtually none when we got there, and after we were attacked and the Iraqi army shot into the neighborhoods, a man came in, shot through the chest, a boy came in, shot through the leg, and so this cycle began to be repeated. Every time we would go out, people would mortar the hospital, shoot RPGs, and small arms fire, and normally the Iraqi army would fire back. Eventually, somebody suggested that actually staying in the hospital as a fighting force might be a violation of the Geneva Conventions. It was a sergeant who suggested that in the presence of an officer, and a few days later we moved to another building about 50 feet away from the hospital. It was a government building about a stone's throw away, and we started staying there. So the hospital was still mortared, because mortars are not very precise, and so even if they're shooting them at the building 50 feet away, we were still drawing fire into the hospital. Eventually, one of our men and the first soldier in my platoon was killed by an RPG. After that, my unit left the hospital, moved to a different area of the city. Another unit in the regiment took over operations there, and the IA troops remained throughout most of our deployment stationed inside the hospital, on the roof, at the front gate, under the guidance of American advisors. In September 2005, we began a 2-week-long mission, Time magazine dubbed the Battle of Tal Afar. The Army called this Operation Restoring Rights, and if you could advance the slide twice, I believe. Yeah, that's good. The idea is that we would search the entire city, house by house, block by block, and clear it all of weapons. Up until this point, we permitted the Iraqis to keep one AK-47 per adult male per household for self-defense, with about 200,000 residents and several million dark windows from which anyone could shoot at anyone else. This wasn't working well. So we swept through the city with around 8,000 Iraqi and American troops and began to search every house in the city. At this stage, we were relatively respectful of people's property. We sometimes knocked down their front gates with our Bradleys, along with their front walls, and occasionally blew them off the hinges with explosives. But usually we went from rooftop to rooftop and entered their homes from above. We separated the men from the women and the children, questioned people, checked their IDs, collected their weapons, and did fairly light searches of the houses at this point. At the same time, we cordoned off the lower quarter of the city, the southeast corner, which was known as the Sarai neighborhood. We had been repeatedly told that this neighborhood was an insurgent stronghold, so we gave the residents an order to evacuate their homes and provided them camps outside the city for them to stay in. After that, we proceeded to bomb their neighborhood for several days and nights using Spectre C-130 gunships, Apache helicopters, and tank rounds. The idea was supposed to be that the insurgents would stay behind and fight while the civilians left. And on September 10th, a Kurdish militia known as the Peshmerga entered Sarai with U.S. Special Forces soldiers to clear the neighborhood of any remaining insurgents. As they began moving through, our troops entered to gather evidence of the insurgency, and in particular of foreign fighters. As we entered the Sarai neighborhood, we were told to search aggressively to teach the residents there a lesson. don't harbor terrorists. We knocked down doors, dumped drawers out, pushed furniture over, broke windows, and generally trashed the homes we went through. You can advance the next slide. In the end, my platoon found absolutely no evidence of foreign fighters, no weapons caches, except, next slide please. Next slide. Keep going. Again. And one more. So these are just houses that we searched. It shows the search process. And keep going. And keep going. And advance the slide. And one more. Okay, one more after that. All right, that's where I wanted to end up. This is a representative photograph of evidence of the insurgency. I was asked to take this photograph by the officer on the scene, a commissioned officer. Next slide, please. This is another picture of evidence of the insurgency in the Sarai neighborhood. I remember someone said the saws might be used for by terrorists to dismember bodies. And the officer, standing nearby, asked suggestively, seriously, why would anyone have this many saws? As though having wood saws was suspicious. In the end, we photographed kitchen knives, wood saws, some ragged old pistol belts, and empty bottles of antibiotics. After we had searched the entire Sarai neighborhood ahead of schedule and found no resistance, someone in the chain of command came up with another suggestion. Maybe the insurgents somehow escaped north to another neighborhood just past our checkpoints. So we struck out September 12th and sent the Peshmerga, which is a Kurdish militia, in to round up every military-age male from every house in another section of the city. We sat about 500 men down in a large C-wire enclosure, which is barbed wire, stood guard as their families all gathered on the other side of the street. At that point, one of our interpreters sent a single masked man in desert camouflage, anonymous, up and down the lines of men. He gave either a thumbs up or a thumbs down before each man he passed. Thumbs up meant the guy was a terrorist. Thumbs down it meant he wasn't. In this way, we detained about 50 men from the group, zip-tied them, and in some cases wrote their alleged crime, cuts heads, for instance, on their arm with a permanent marker. Again, another commissioned officer, seeing that one of these detainees had cuts heads written on his arm, is quoted in the Washington Post as saying, "You're going to get special treatment now, buddy." The rest of the men were released back to their families, and I have no idea what happened to the 50 or so who were loaded up into trucks and taken away. It's hard for me to believe that the Iraqis who witnessed this could possibly take seriously our version of justice and democracy. Anyway, one of the other statements made in the press around this time was one by our squadron commander, Lieutenant Colonel Hickey. He was quoted in the Washington Post as saying, "If we go in there and tear these homes apart, we lose these people," which makes sense to me. It's consistent with counterinsurgency doctrine, which places an emphasis on winning the support of the local population. But after Operation Restoring Rights ended, we continued our aggressive search tactics. I decided to email Lieutenant Colonel Hickey recently, and I asked him about this. He replied, "The way you describe being aggressive in our search, I would characterize as being disrespectful and counterproductive to what we were trying to do. I do not support tactics that ransacked homes." Can you go back to one of the ransacked home pictures, please? So where did things go wrong? There's no question that we ransacked homes and did so under orders. Equally, it's clear to me that this kind of behavior was not consistent with counterinsurgency doctrine, in which Colonel McMaster, the commander of our regiment, was clearly well-versed. I have to conclude that in the best of situations in Iraq, a deployment which may be lamentably one of the better operations in the course of the war, civilians still die, questionable decisions are still made, the insurgency still rages on, and it seems as though in the end, the only war our country has really waged well is a propaganda war on its own people.